is Cindy Hernandez, and for my primary source project, I decided to cover Margaret Floy Washburn. In my personal opinion, I think she's one of the most important and, if not most overlooked figures in early psychology. Here's kind of some main focuses that I wanted to maintain throughout my paper. So I have three main focuses. The first one is the obstacles that she faced as a woman in a male-dominated field and kind of how she's overcoming these misogynistic and stereotypical beliefs that are centered around the origins of when psychology first started off. The second one is her work, The Animal Mind, which challenged the assumptions about consciousness and if human beings are not the only ones that can have a consciousness. And then the third is just her major contributions to the development of comparative psychology. And her work, The Animal Mind, is considered one of the first works of comparative psychology in text. And by the end of this, I'm hoping you'll see why Washburn was considered a pioneer that essentially reshaped the field, and also at the same time just working against the heavy gender bias that was actively trying to go against her and her chances of success in establishing herself in this new field. And then I left a little bit of questions as an overview. Who is Margaret Floy Washburn and why is she so influential in psychology? We'll get deeper into that, but just as a general overview, she was the first woman to ever receive a PhD in psychology, and she helped formalize the study of animal behavior long before behaviorism or neuroscience even existed. So I think it's very important that she is talked about a lot more. So kind of going into her early life and her education. She was born in 1871 in New York City. Despite the fact that both of her parents had very little education, she showed a lot of exceptional intelligence. She went to a very prestigious private school, and she was just very intelligent, and she was able to attend college at the age of 15. The first college she ever attended was Vassar College, and that's where she was introduced to psychology through one of her mandated courses that she needed to graduate. Once she did graduate, she strived to attend Columbia University, but at this time, Columbia was not allowing women into their graduate programs. So they let her in as an audit essentially, but she wasn't permitted to earn credits. And there is an instance of G. Stanley Hall that advocated for the admission of women into this graduate program, but he faced a lot of backlash in return. One person that also was advocating for her, although she wasn't getting the credits at Columbia University, James McKean Cattell kind of helped guide her through her first experimental project. He advised her to transfer over to Cornell University, and over there she studied under Edward B. Titchener, and from that point on she was able to earn her PhD and become the first woman in U.S. history to do so. Even prior to getting her PhD, Wilhelm Wundt helped a lot in her progression in establishing herself as a reliable psychologist in the field. He went on to publish Margaret's work on the influence of visual imagery on judgment of tactual distance and perception, which would be published into one of the first journals of experimental psychology. And going more into the misogyny of early psychology, it was very centered around biased assumptions, and more so especially about women. If we can go back and reference previous influential figures that we've talked about from chapters in our text, we can reference back to Pierre Paul Broca. He was the one that was centered around craniometry and argued that the smaller female brain size meant that intellectual inferiority was reflected based on that size, essentially saying that men were more intellectual and just superior to women based on the brain sizes. And yeah, he believed that we were inferior products of evolution. And another example of this is Francis Galton, and he openly made sexist claims about women's abilities. It would be things such as like men agreed that women can't successfully make a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And although Broca's research on the brain and trying to measure intellectual inferiority and intelligence based off of brain size alone was proven to be unreliable, but the long-lasting impacts of misogyny still remain. As a result, women were struggling to get into graduate programs, be in research labs, and also be professionals in the fields of psychology. I encourage everyone to kind of look back and reflect on the photo we saw at the beginning of the semester, which reflects the first APA meeting. We talked about the concerns that we see in this photo, kind of regarding how there's no women, there's no people of color represented. So not only was there that biasness towards women, but there was a lot of misconceptions and a lot of stereotypes against minority groups, marginalized groups. And then I want to compare Washburn's ideas to one of her mentors, Edward Titchener, because they are very contrasting. So Titchener was very much structuralism based. He believed that introspection was the only method of studying the mind. He focused on bringing consciousness down into its smallest elements. He rejected the idea that animals could have consciousness just because they couldn't introspect. And he also rejected motor theories, which link thought to movement. And then on the other hand, we have Washburn, who's pioneering comparative psychology. She believed consciousness can be studied through behavior in animals, so extending that branch of psychology beyond just the human mind and trying to extend that to how we can utilize animals to understand behavior and consciousness. She also used observation and experimentation rather than just simply introspection as the only option, and also proposed motor theory of consciousness, that mental processes are tied to bodily movement. She also became a founder of comparative psychology. And Washburn did respect Titchener as a mentor, but challenged the foundations of his theories. And this was also during a time where introspection was basically like you don't question it and you don't challenge it, but she still went ahead and did. And of course, going into one of her most well-known works, The Animal Mind, a textbook of comparative psychology. This was published back in 1908, and it was the first textbook ever written on animal psychology. In this work, Washburn argues that animals do have a mental process, and this includes perception, this includes attention, memory, learning, basically trying to argue that consciousness is not just limited to humans. And that's kind of the state that psychology was in for a while, where it was strictly just humans. And we also were gaining this superiority complex in the sense that we as humans are the only ones that could have a conscious, and like therefore we are special. And this behavioral evidence can reveal mental states. And this directly challenged Titchener and other structuralists who insisted that without introspection, we can't study the mind. And at this time, again, introspection was so deeply rooted in religion and the idea that human beings were the only conscious beings. And because we can't really have animals tell us exactly what their thoughts were, many psychologists were under the impression that they just don't introspect, and if they can't introspect, then they have no conscious mind. And then again, tying it all back to like that superiority that we have as humans, I kind of was tying this back to Copernicus, I hope that's how you say it, when he was the astronomer that basically proposed that we are not the center of the universe, and we do not have the planets revolving around us. We revolve around the sun, and the sun is the center of the universe. And that was a very big controversial no, because to many who were so heavily in their religious beliefs, we were God's like special creations, and therefore like we were so special we had to be in the center of the universe. So just more so like challenging the idea that we're not the only ones with a conscious was kind of on the same boat of like it was hard to accept, especially in a time where introspection was the respected method of measuring consciousness. And then going more into the animal mind, Washburn reviewed so many different kinds of experiments. She reviewed things like maze learning and trial and error behavior, problem solving, sensory discrimination. And from this, she was able to conclude behavioral data. So that included the animal's experience of sensations, attention, memory, learning, maybe even some awareness. And combined with her motor theory of consciousness, she was able to argue that mental processes and movements are intertwined, and modern neuroscience strongly supports this now. And Washburn was typically not ever the one to run experiments herself on animals. It was more so systematically where she would analyze studies that involved different species and different tasks that they were giving, such as like cats escaping puzzles or rats navigating through mazes, and wanted to basically reflect a mental organization. And this analyzation is what basically led us to comparative psychology, as she compared the different species and how they perform with these different tasks. And going into modern psychology, Washburn's work anticipated what modern psychology and neuroscience can now confirm. I think a really great example of how this is being used now, there was a study in 2024 where they used MRIs for dogs. And in this study, the dogs were scanned using the MRI machines during emotional and social tasks, and the researchers found activation in brain regions related to emotion, attention, social bonding, the same regions that we as humans utilize. And this supports Washburn's claim that animal consciousness does exist, that mental states can be inferred from behavior, and mental processes are not unique to humans. We see that among not just dogs or not just rats, but among very different species. And going more into Margaret's legacy and how she leaves that impact in the field of psychology, she openly challenged structuralism when it was so heavily dominated in psychology. She advanced the idea that consciousness exists on a continuum across species. She helped establish comparative psychology as a legitimate branch of science, and she broke gender barriers and became a very big role model for women in psychology. Her work continues to influence cognitive science, animal research, and debates about consciousness to this day. She broke history being the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology, but she is much more than that. She was a pioneer who pushed the field forward and shaped it into what it is today. She confronted misogyny, she challenged scientific assumptions, and she expanded our understanding of consciousness beyond just the human mind. Here are all my references, and that's all. Thank you so much, and please leave me any questions if you have.